All right, let's jump right in. For billions of people, the Quran is a source of guidance, a source of truth, but it's also a text of incredible depth. It's filled with passages that can feel like complex puzzles, even for scholars. So today, we're going to look at the Quran through three really different lenses: as a text with some apparent contradictions, as a source for a legal system that's actually rooted in mercy, and as a historical artifact with a radical new origin story that might just change everything. So let's start with a classic example of one of these puzzles. On the one hand, the Quran seems crystal clear. Wine and other strong drinks, forbidden. It actually calls them Satan's handiwork. But then, it turns around and promises rivers of wine as a reward in paradise. So how does that work? How can something that's an infamy here on earth become a divine reward in the afterlife? This is the kind of textual challenge that people have been thinking about for centuries. And what's so interesting is that struggling with these kinds of passages isn't some modern thing. It's actually a core part of the Islamic intellectual tradition. For well over 1,000 years, brilliant thinkers have dedicated their entire lives to unpacking the context, the nuances, and all the layers of meaning in this text. Which brings us to the big question for today. When you come across a passage that's challenging, how do you actually figure out what it means? We're going to explore two very different ways to answer that, and we'll start with one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of Islam. Okay, so our first approach is through the lens of Islamic law, or Sharia. This is the tradition where jurists try to answer the question, what does God want from us in pretty much any situation you can imagine? And believe me, it leads to some really surprising places, especially when you look at the Quran's commands for severe punishments, the ones known as hudud. Let's just be real for a second. When a lot of people in the West hear the word Sharia, their minds immediately jump to these really harsh images, right? Stoning, hand amputations. We've all seen it in movies and news headlines. But how accurate is that picture, really? Well, get this. The gap between that perception and the reality is huge. Those severe hudud punishments, they make up less than 2% of a standard comprehensive book on Islamic law. The other 98%? It's all about prayer, charity, business contracts, family law, everything else. So these punishments are just a tiny, tiny fraction of the whole system. And even inside that tiny fraction, this is the guiding principle. This is a statement from a hadith, a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, and it's the bedrock of the whole approach. It is better for the authority to err in mercy than to err in punishment. This isn't just some nice quote, it's a legal maxim. The system is actually designed to lean towards mercy. And you see this principle tested most in the case of hudud crimes. These are the big ones, the violations against God, with punishments that are laid out right there in the scripture. So the question becomes, how can a system that's all about mercy deal with rules that seem so absolute and severe? And let's be clear, the punishments listed in the texts are severe. We're talking about lashing, stoning, amputation. The stakes are incredibly high. So it really makes you wonder, if the whole point is mercy, why have these rules at all? Well, the answer lies in this absolutely critical legal idea called shubahat. What this means is that a judge has a religious duty to actively look for any doubt, any ambiguity, any possible loophole to avoid applying these severe hudud punishments. It's like a legal escape hatch that's built right into the system on purpose. And this isn't just a theory. I mean, look at the standard of proof for adultery or zina. You don't just need witnesses, you need 4 eyewitnesses. And not just to the couple being alone, but to the actual act of penetration. The Prophet himself described the standard as needing to see it like an eyeliner applier entering its container. I mean, it's basically impossible. On top of that, a confession has to be made 4 separate times, and the judge practically encourages the person to take it back. And if they do, the charge is dropped. Instantly. Even pregnancy isn't considered proof. The bar is set so high, it's almost designed to be unreachable. Yeah, this quote from the scholar Rudolf Peters just nails it. The rules are so strict that it is, quote, nearly impossible for someone to actually be sentenced for one of these crimes, unless they basically show up and insist on being punished. So you see, the law acts as this really strong moral warning, but its actual application is meant to be incredibly rare and filtered through this deep commitment to mercy. So does this mean a person just gets away with it? Not really. Think about it like the O.J. Simpson trials. In the criminal trial, the standard of proof was super high, beyond a reasonable doubt, and he was found not guilty. But in the civil trial, the standard was lower, and he was found liable. It's kind of similar here. Someone might avoid the super high standard of a hudud punishment, but a judge can still give them a lesser discretionary punishment. That's called tazir, for the very same act. Okay, so that's one really powerful way to understand the Quran's tough passages, through this deep, merciful legal tradition. But what if the answer isn't about legal interpretation at all? What if the real key is in a totally different story about where the text even came from in the first place? Now we're going to shift gears completely. We're about to dive into an unpublished academic theory that's been making waves in some online forums, and it offers a pretty radical way of rethinking how the Quran came to be. The theory is called the Mohammedan palimpsest, and it's from a historian named Khalid Belkin. So, a palimpsest, if you haven't heard the term, is an old manuscript where the original writing was scraped off so something new could be written on top, but you can still see faint traces of the old text underneath. And that idea is key here. At its heart, the Mohammedan palimpsest theory argues that the Quran wasn't a brand new creation. Instead, it suggests that there was an older, pre-Islamic book that was fundamentally reworked, with new layers and ideas added over time. According to this theory, the Quran we have today is made up of 4 different layers, all woven together. You've got a base layer from an original ancient Arabic book, then a second layer of texts from other old scrolls, a third layer of material that was translated from Aramaic Jewish sources, and then finally, the 4th layer, the original contributions from the Prophet Muhammad himself, tying it all together. So you might be asking, where's the proof for an idea this big? Well, one of the key clues, according to Belkin, are the mysterious, disconnected letters you find at the start of 29 chapters, things like Alif Lam Mim. Nobody's ever been totally sure what they mean. Belkin's theory? They're actually the garbled leftovers of a Syriac numbering system from that original book, which people later misunderstood and thought were some kind of mystical code. Now, to be fair, Belkin himself admits his theory doesn't explain every single puzzle perfectly. He uses this really cool analogy. He says it's like investigating a crime scene. You might find enough clues to prove that a crime definitely happened, even if you can't explain every weird little thing the perpetrator did. For him, the point isn't to have a perfect explanation for everything, but to show that these traces, these clues, are there. Of course, a theory this bold is going to face some tough questions. For example, if the letters were chapter numbers, why do some of them repeat? What about all the chapters that don't have any letters at all? And since we know the earliest companions of the Prophet sometimes had the chapters in a different order, how could one numbering system work for all of them? These are all big hurdles the theory has to clear. So there you have it. We've gone on this incredible journey, looking at the Quran in 3 totally different ways. We started with those textual puzzles that spark so much debate. Then we delve into a legal tradition that prioritizes mercy to navigate some of the text's toughest commands. And we ended with a pretty wild, radical new theory about where the text even came from. And what all this really shows us is that a text like the Qur'an isn't some flat document you can just read one way. Whether you come at it as a believer, a lawyer, or historian, each perspective reveals a totally new and fascinating layer of complexity. Each one raises different questions and gives you different kinds of answers. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. How does knowing that all these different frameworks exist, seeing a text as a puzzle, as a source of law, or as a historical artifact, how does that change our own understanding of what it means to engage with a sacred book? What do we gain and what's challenged when we try to hold all of those perspectives at the same time?